When I was younger, maybe 14 or 15, my family used to go camping a lot. We weren't a fancy family or anything. We'd just pack up the tent, some food, and sleeping bags, and head out to the state park near where we lived. It was one of those parks with big old trees, winding trails, and a small lake in the middle where people fished and swam. I remember the smell of pine and the way the dirt felt under my shoes, how the air always smelled different when you were deep in the woods. I had a good friend back then, Jason. He was my neighbor and about the same age. His family camped with us sometimes, and even when they didn't, he'd often come along on the trips. We were both a little restless, and every night, after the adults were sitting around the fire talking or cooking, we would go for a walk in the woods. We called it the ritual. It wasn't anything official, just something we liked doing. We'd slip away from the campsite when it got dark, carrying flashlights, and walk the trails or wander off them a little, daring each other to keep going further each time. We liked to turn off our flashlights sometimes, too. I don't know why, maybe to feel brave, maybe just for the challenge. Walking through dark woods with only moonlight and starlight to guide you was strangely exciting. You could hear the rustle of the trees, the snapping of twigs under your own feet, the distant chirps of crickets, or sometimes the hoot of an owl. It was creepy, but in a way we enjoyed. This one night stood out, though. I still remember it clearly. It was summer, probably late July or early August. The air was warm, but at night it cooled down just enough to make you comfortable. The adults were busy at the campsite, probably drinking and talking like they usually did. So Jason and I decided it was time for the ritual. We grabbed our flashlights and set out, but that night we were feeling a little bolder. We decided we'd go further into the woods than we usually did. We didn't tell anyone where we were going, we never did, but we figured we'd just follow the main trail and maybe loop back around. It was maybe 9 or 10 at night, and the moon was high, casting pale light over the trees. We turned off the flashlights after a while, letting our eyes adjust. I remember how the dirt path looked almost silver under the moonlight, how the trees on either side cast long shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. We joked quietly, trying not to laugh too loud, and kept walking deeper in. We were probably half a mile from the nearest campsite when we heard it, a soft, low whispering behind us. It was faint, but enough to make both of us stop. We froze for a second, glanced at each other, and then switched on our flashlights, spinning around to shine them behind us. Nothing. The trees stood silent, swaying slightly in the wind. The underbrush didn't move. There were no animals, no people, just quiet woods. We shrugged it off. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe one of us imagined it and the other just went along with it. So we kept walking. A few minutes later, we heard it again. The whispering, but this time a little louder. It wasn't words we could make out, just a soft, mumbling sound. We stopped again, and this time we didn't just spin around and flash the lights once. We really looked, scanning the trees and the ground carefully. I remember feeling a little nervous now. It didn't feel like a game anymore. The woods were supposed to be empty, at least this deep at night. Jason whispered that maybe we should head back. I agreed, and we turned around, starting to make our way back toward the campsite. That's when we saw her. Out from behind a tree, maybe 20 feet away, a figure crawled into the faint light of our flashlights. It was a woman, wearing dark clothes, her hair messy, her skin and clothes streaked with dirt. She was on her hands and knees, moving slowly, whispering something under her breath. I felt my heart jump into my throat. My first thought was that she was hurt. Why else would someone be crawling like that, alone this far into the woods? But as we watched, she slowly raised her head and looked at us. Her eyes were wide, unfocused. Then, without warning, she stood up. She was swaying a little, like she couldn't quite keep her balance, and she called out that she was looking for her campsite. We didn't know what to do at first. I remember feeling frozen, like my legs didn't want to move. But after a moment, we walked toward her carefully, keeping our flashlights on her. Up close, we could see how bad she looked. Her clothes were ripped in places, her arms and legs scratched up, and she smelled strongly of alcohol. She wasn't making a lot of sense. She kept mumbling things, half talking to herself, half to us, not really answering when we asked anything. We tried to help her walk, and she leaned on us heavily, stumbling every few steps. took us a while to get back to the campground. She kept pulling us the wrong way or stopping suddenly to whisper something or stare at nothing. The whole time, I kept thinking about how we'd almost turned back earlier, how we'd almost not gone that far into the woods at all. If we hadn't been out there, I honestly think she might have stayed lost all night. When we finally made it back to the edge of the campground, we brought her to the main trail where the campsites branched off. We asked her which group she was with, but she just shook her head. So we walked with her from site to site, looking for anyone who recognized her. It turned out her friends hadn't even noticed she was gone. They were a group a little ways down from us, sitting around their fire, drinking and laughing. When we brought her over, they were surprised but not exactly panicked. They said she'd gone to find the bathroom a while ago, and they figured she was just taking her time. I remember feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. On one hand, I was glad she wasn't hurt or something worse, but on the other hand, it was unsettling to think about how easily she'd gotten lost, how far she'd wandered, and how long she might have stayed out there if we hadn't stumbled across her. After we handed her off, Jason and I went back to our own campsite. We didn't say much. We just sat by the fire for a while, listening to the crackle of the wood and the occasional murmur of the adults. I kept thinking about how dark it had been out there, how easily you could miss something just a few feet away, how the woods could swallow you up without anyone noticing. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the roof of the tent. I could still hear the faint sounds of the woods outside, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I thought about the woman's dirt-covered hands, the way her eyes had looked when she saw us, the way she'd whispered random words to herself. It stuck with me for a long time after, not because anything terrible had happened. She was just drunk, just lost. But it made me realize how fragile things were out there, how easy it was to slip off the path, to get disoriented, to be forgotten, even by the people who were supposed to be looking out for you. Jason and I kept doing the ritual after that, but we were more careful. We didn't go as far, and we kept our flashlights on more often. We never talked much about that night, but I know we both remembered it. Looking back now, I'm grateful we went as far as we did. I'm grateful we found her. But every time I think about camping, every time I think about the dark woods and the quiet whispering of the trees at night, I remember that feeling, the cold, creeping realization that even a familiar place can turn strange and dangerous in an instant, and that sometimes you only get lucky by accident. That night didn't end with anything dramatic. No police were called, no one got hurt, and by the next morning, the campground was back to its usual cheerful noise. Kids running around, people cooking breakfast, dogs barking. But I knew, deep down, that it could have ended differently. And that's the part that stayed with me. Not the fear or the excitement, but the understanding that sometimes things only turn out okay because you were in the right place at the right time, and that next time you might not be. When I was younger, around 14 or 15, my family used to camp a lot at a state park not too far from where we lived. It was one of those big, spread-out parks with long, winding trails, thick woods, a small lake, and plenty of basic campsites. Nothing fancy, no RV hookups or anything. Just open spots with dirt patches for tents, picnic tables, and rusty metal fire rings. The bathrooms were usually a little walk away, sometimes down dim paths, and once the sun went down, the whole place got really dark. You had the glow of the campfires and a couple of lanterns here and there, but out beyond that, it was just blackness and trees. My friend Jason almost always came with us on these trips. We were tight, the kind of friends who knew everything about each other, always laughing, daring each other to do dumb stuff and staying up way too late. On these camping trips, we had a little routine, we called it the ritual. After dinner, once our parents were settled around the fire, drinking beers and talking about boring adult things, we'd sneak off into the woods with our flashlights. It wasn't like we were doing anything bad, just walking, exploring, sometimes seeing how far we could go without getting scared. We liked to turn off the flashlights sometimes just to test ourselves, to see if we could make it through the trees in the dark with only the moonlight. It always made us feel a little nervous, a little brave, and we loved that thrill. That particular night sticks in my mind like nothing else. It was late July or maybe early August, right in the middle of a long stretch of heat. Even after dark, the air was sticky and hot, clinging to our skin and making our shirts damp with sweat. The woods were alive with the usual summer sounds: crickets chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional snap of a branch when something small moved nearby. We waited until the adults were deep in conversation, then grabbed our flashlights and headed out. The trail was familiar, a narrow dirt path that wound through the trees. We'd walked it dozens of times, maybe more. We knew where the roots stuck up, where the ground dipped, where the old fallen log lay across the side. We went further than usual that night. Maybe it was the heat, maybe it was boredom, or maybe we just wanted to push ourselves a little. We turned off our flashlights after a while, letting the moonlight guide us. It was almost bright enough, casting pale light over the ground, the leaves, the jagged shapes of the trees. We were probably half a mile from the nearest campsite when we heard it. It was faint at first, a soft whispering noise behind us. We both stopped. I remember the feeling that washed over me, that tightening in my chest, the way the hairs on my arms stood up. Jason clicked his flashlight back on, and I did the same. We turned around, shining the beams back down the trail, sweeping them left and right. Nothing, just trees, branches, underbrush. We stood there for a moment, listening hard. Silence. Finally, we turned back and kept walking. I told myself it was the wind or maybe some animal moving through the brush, something normal, something harmless. But a few minutes later, we heard it again. The whispering was clearer this time, closer. We stopped again, shining our lights all around, searching the shadows. The noise faded, then picked up again, soft, broken words we couldn't make out, like someone talking under their breath, just out of sight. That's when we saw her. She was crawling on the ground, maybe 20 feet away, off the side of the trail. At first, we didn't even realize it was a person, just a dark shape moving low through the grass and dirt. She was dressed in black or dark gray, her clothes torn and filthy, her hair hanging in matted clumps around her face. Her hands dug into the dirt as she dragged herself forward, her knees scraping over rocks and roots. And all the while, she was whispering. We stood frozen, watching her, not sure what we were seeing. Then she lifted her head. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt, her eyes wide and unfocused. She swayed a little, then pushed herself up, standing unsteadily. She looked around, her head tilting in small, sharp movements, like she was sniffing the air or listening for something we couldn't hear. I remember the way her arms hung at her sides, limp and loose, her fingers twitching slightly. She swayed again, her body trembling, like she was barely holding herself up. And then, without warning, she let out this low, strange sound, almost like a growl, but not quite. It was deep and rough, rising up from her chest, cutting off into a sharp breath. Something about it sent panic shooting through me. Jason grabbed my arm, and we turned, heading quickly back the way we came. Not running yet, but walking fast, our flashlights bouncing in our hands. Behind us, we heard the shuffling sound of her moving, the soft scrape of feet or hands against the ground. I wanted to look back, but I couldn't. My stomach was in knots, my heart hammering in my chest. The air felt heavy, like the whole forest was pressing in on us. We moved faster. The trail seemed longer now, darker. Every sound made me jump. The crack of a branch underfoot, the rustle of leaves, the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. And then that sound again, a low, guttural noise, halfway between a cough and a snarl. It didn't sound human. We broke into a run. Our flashlights bobbed wildly, the beams slicing through the dark, catching glimpses of tree trunks, rocks, patches of grass. I could hear Jason's breath, ragged and fast, the slap of his sneakers on the dirt, the rush of air as we sprinted back toward camp. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know how close she was. We didn't stop until we burst out of the trees and back into the light of the campground. The fire was still going, the adults still sitting around it, talking and laughing like nothing was wrong. We stumbled into our campsite, gasping for breath, sweat pouring down our faces, our hands shaking. We didn't tell anyone. We sat by the fire, trying to calm down, glancing nervously at the dark line of trees at the edge of the campground. Every now and then, I thought I saw something move, a shadow, a flicker of motion, But when I looked directly, there was nothing there. Later that night, lying in my sleeping bag, I kept thinking about her. The way she crawled, the strange way her body moved, the sounds she made, and the look on her face. It wasn't just fear or confusion. It was something else, something I couldn't name, something that made my skin crawl. The next morning, everything was normal. People were packing up their gear, making breakfast, laughing and talking. No one said anything about a woman in the woods. No one reported anyone missing. Jason and I didn't talk about it. Not then, not later, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Because deep down, I knew we hadn't just stumbled across a lost camper or someone drunk or high, trying to find their way back. We'd seen something in the middle of changing, caught it at a moment when it wasn't fully human, wasn't fully anything. We saw it too soon or maybe too late, and we were lucky we walked away. That night taught me something I've never forgotten. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters or creatures from stories. Sometimes the scariest thing is a person right on the edge of losing themselves, changing into something you can't understand, something you can't reason with. We didn't save her. We didn't help her. We just ran. And I've spent years wondering what would have happened if we'd stayed just a little longer. About 10 years ago, when I was in my early 20s, I went camping at Ginny Springs in Florida. If you've never been, it's one of those famous camping spots. Crystal clear springs, a beautiful river, lots of space for swimming, tubing, and relaxing. But more than anything, it's surrounded by these towering old trees. Huge oaks and pines, some of them so big you'd need 3 people to wrap your arms around them. Spanish moss hangs off the branches like curtains, and when the wind blows through, it all moves in this slow, swaying dance. I went with a small group of friends, maybe 4 or 5 of us, just for a weekend away. We wanted to escape the usual routine, the city noise, the stress, the screens, and spend time outside. We had tents, coolers full of drinks, food to cook over a fire, and a couple of inner tubes for the river. We were ready for a fun, laid-back weekend. We got to the campsite sometime in the afternoon, checked in, and found a spot we liked. The campground wasn't packed, but it wasn't empty either. There were plenty of other groups, families, couples, all scattered around. The air was hot and thick, the sun beating down through the gaps in the trees, but near the river, it felt cooler. We set up our tents in a flat, sandy spot with some shade, rolled out sleeping bags, and organized everything. Once camp was set, we spent the rest of the afternoon floating on the water, splashing around, just enjoying the day. The river was clear and cool, the kind of water you can see right to the bottom. We swam, floated on the tubes, laid out on the grass, just doing the usual summer camping stuff. As evening rolled around, we headed back to camp. Someone got the fire going while the rest of us dried off and got changed. We cooked a simple dinner, hot dogs, chips, marshmallows, and sat around the fire, drinking and talking, watching the sky turn dark. The stars came out, the crickets started chirping, and the air cooled just enough to make it comfortable. I remember that feeling of peace, of sitting out there under the trees with the fire crackling, the smell of smoke in the air, and the faint sound of the river nearby. We stayed up pretty late, laughing and joking, until we were all too tired to keep our eyes open. One by one, we drifted off to our tents. I climbed into mine, zipped it up, stretched out on my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. The sounds of the forest were soft but constant. The occasional rustle of leaves, insects buzzing, the distant splash of water. For a while, I just lay there, letting the night settle around me. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound that I will never forget. It was loud, incredibly loud. A deep, cracking, splitting noise, followed by a heavy, echoing crash. It sounded like the earth itself had opened up, or like a building collapsing. The ground seemed to shake under me, the noise rolling through the trees like a wave. For a moment, I just lay there, frozen, my heart pounding. Then it hit me, it was a tree. A huge tree had fallen. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that trees fall sometimes, especially in old forests. Maybe it was dead or weak, maybe a branch had snapped and pulled the rest down. I tried to calm myself, tried to tell myself to go back to sleep. But then, maybe 10 minutes later, I started hearing voices. Lots of voices. At first, they were far away, muffled, but they grew louder, more frantic. People were moving around outside, flashlights flickering, feet crunching through the underbrush. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, blinking in the sudden brightness of all the flashlights cutting through the dark. I saw a small crowd of people gathered maybe 50 or 60 feet away, just beyond a couple of campsites. Some were holding lights, some were on their phones, some were just standing there, wide-eyed and pale. I walked over, feeling that sinking feeling in my chest, that heavy sense that something was wrong. And then I saw it. A massive oak tree, easily several feet across at the base, had come crashing down right on top of a tent. The tent was crushed, flattened under the thick trunk and heavy branches, barely recognizable. People were standing around, some trying to help, some just staring. I heard someone say they called 911, that an ambulance was on the way, but they didn't know how long it would take to get out here. Time seemed to stretch and twist, every second feeling long and heavy. Someone was shouting for quiet, trying to listen, trying to see if there were any sounds from inside the crushed tent, but no one heard anything. More time passed. I don't know how long, maybe 30 minutes, maybe more. Then we heard the helicopter. It came in low over the trees, the thudding sound of its blades growing louder and louder until it was hovering above the campsite. Emergency lights flashed through the trees. More people arrived. Paramedics, park staff, maybe even police. They worked fast, clearing people back, cutting through branches, working under the heavy weight of the tree. But no matter how hard they worked, the mood stayed heavy, dark, like everyone already knew how this was going to end. And they were right. By the time they got the person out, it was too late. I stood there, watching from a distance, feeling cold all over despite the humid night air. It was the kind of cold that sinks into your bones, the kind that has nothing to do with temperature. It didn't matter that I didn't know the person, that I'd never even seen them before that night. All I could think about was how random it was, how easily it could have been any of us. I thought about the trees above my own tent, about the way they swayed in the wind, the heavy branches, the creaking sounds they sometimes made. I thought about how I'd heard the crash but hadn't gotten up, hadn't even realized how bad it was until I saw it with my own eyes. The helicopter eventually lifted off, carrying the body away. The crowd slowly broke apart, people drifting back to their own campsites, silent, pale, shaken. I went back to my tent, sat down on my sleeping bag, and just stared at the fabric walls around me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, listening to every sound, every groan of the trees, every rustle of leaves. Every creak made me flinch, every gust of wind sent my heart racing. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things as quickly as I could. My friends were quiet too, all of us tired, pale, haunted by what we'd seen. We didn't talk much on the drive home. There wasn't anything to say. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. Not because it was some ghost story or something supernatural, but because it was real. Because it reminded me how fragile everything is, how easily life can change in an instant. 1 minute you're lying in a tent, safe and warm, listening to the sounds of the night. The next minute, a tree comes down, and everything is over. I've gone camping since then, but I never camp under big trees anymore. I look up, I check the branches, I think about where I set up my tent. Because sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what's out there in the dark. It's the things we never think about until it's too late. About 7 years ago, I went on a weekend camping trip that I still think about, not because anything supernatural happened, but because it was a reminder of how real-life accidents can be the scariest, most unsettling things. I was about 23 back then, and a few friends and I decided to spend a couple of days camping at a state park a few hours from where we lived. It was summer, hot and humid, the kind of Florida weather where the air feels thick and the bugs are everywhere. Still, we were looking forward to it. A break from work, phones, noise, just a couple of days surrounded by trees, water, and quiet. There were 4 of us in total. We had 2 tents, coolers packed with drinks and snacks, folding chairs, and fishing gear. We picked a spot we liked. Tucked under some big oak trees, with enough shade to keep us cool during the day but close enough to the water so we could hear the soft sounds of the river at night. When we first arrived, we spent time setting up camp, clearing the ground for the tents, gathering some firewood, and figuring out where to cook. It was the usual kind of camping preparation, nothing special. Once everything was set up, we cracked open some drinks, settled into our chairs, and just let ourselves relax. That first day passed easily. We fished a little, swam in the river, took some short hikes around the trails. By evening, we were sitting around a small campfire, roasting hot dogs and marshmallows, talking about nothing in particular. As the night stretched on, the campfire burned down low, and the forest around us filled with the usual night sounds. Crickets, frogs, the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. The air stayed warm, but there was a slight breeze that moved through the trees, making them creak softly overhead. Eventually, sometime past midnight, we all decided to call it a night. One by one, we climbed into our tents. I was sharing mine with my friend Jake, while the other two, Chris and Dylan, took the second tent. I laid back in my sleeping bag, listening to the muffled sounds of the forest, feeling the slow drift into sleep. But sometime deep into the night, I was jolted awake by a noise. It was loud. Not just loud, it was massive. A crack, sharp and sudden, followed by the sound of something huge crashing down through the branches. It was like the ground itself shuddered, like a giant hand had slapped down into the earth. For a second, I just lay there, frozen, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My first thought was that an animal had come through camp, maybe a bear or something big. But no, the sound wasn't footsteps or growls. It was something breaking, splitting, something heavy collapsing. A tree. A huge tree must have fallen. Slowly, cautiously, I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the darkness. The night air hit my face, damp and warm. My flashlight was in my hand, but I didn't turn it on right away. I just stood there, letting my eyes adjust, ears straining to catch any sound. I heard voices, faint at first but getting louder. Not from my own group, but from further down the trail, other campers. That's when I noticed that the air felt different, heavy, tense. There was this strange stillness, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I flicked on my flashlight and slowly made my way toward the noise. As I walked, more details came into focus. A crushed tent, people standing around it, some holding their phones, others just frozen in place. Flashlights bounced around the trees, catching glimpses of the wreckage. I moved closer, heart thudding in my chest. The fallen tree was enormous. Its thick trunk lay across a campsite maybe 100 feet from ours, its branches tangled in tents and gear. I could see where it had snapped, the jagged break high up where the trunk had given way. It didn't take long to realize someone had been inside that tent. I didn't know the campers, they were strangers, part of another group. But even from where I stood, I could feel the shock and horror radiating through the crowd. Some people were crying, others were on their phones with shaking hands. A few were trying to lift branches, but it was clear the tree was far too big for them to move. I stayed back, feeling helpless, unsure of what to do. I wanted to help, but there was nothing I could do. More time passed. The sounds of sirens echoed faintly through the trees, growing louder as they approached. Then the flashing red and blue lights appeared, weaving through the narrow road into the campground. Paramedics, park rangers, even police officers rushed into the scene. I stood there, watching as they worked, pulling people back, shining powerful lights on the wreckage, assessing the situation. Eventually, they called for a helicopter. The sound of the blades came in low and heavy, cutting through the night air. The grass rippled under the force of the wind as it hovered overhead. For a long time, everything was motion and noise. People working, lights flashing, the helicopter waiting. But after a while, it became clear. They weren't going to find someone to save. They were only there to recover a body. I remember the weight that settled over the campsite, that awful silence that followed the realization. It wasn't just sadness. It was the deep, cold grip of knowing how close we all were to something we couldn't control. That tree could have fallen anywhere, could have been our campsite, could have been my tent. When the helicopter finally lifted off, carrying the body away, the campground emptied out. Some people packed up and left that same night, unable to stay after what they'd seen. My friends and I stayed until morning, but none of us slept. We sat by the dead fire, staring into the ashes, listening to the creaks of the trees overhead. Every gust of wind made me flinch. Every groan of a branch set my nerves on edge. When the sun finally rose, we packed in silence. The ride home was quiet too. None of us wanted to talk about it. There was nothing to say, really. It was just unfortunate. But that word doesn't cover the feeling I carried with me after. The truth is, I've been camping many times since that night. I still love it, the outdoors, the fresh air, the escape. But I never, ever set up under old trees anymore. I look up every time. I check for dead branches. I check the ground for signs of rot or weakness. I pay attention to where I lay my head at night. Because what I learned that night is simple. You can do everything right. You can be prepared, careful, responsible. But sometimes nature has its own plans, and no matter how ready you think you are, you can't stop a tree from falling. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't about monsters or ghosts. Sometimes they're about being reminded that life is fragile, and that random, awful things happen. Fast, silent, and final. About 10 years ago, I was working as a safari guide in South Africa, deep in the Lowveld, where the land stretches out wide and flat, covered in thorny bushes, dry grass, and scattered trees. Back then, I spent most of my time in the bush, guiding small groups of tourists through the parks, leading walking tours, tracking animals, and setting up camp in remote spots far from the paved roads and tourist lodges. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was the one I loved. Days were long and dusty, and nights were cold, especially in winter when the temperatures often dropped close to freezing. The camps we used were basic: canvas tents, a small fire pit, and simple equipment. We weren't in fenced areas. The wild was all around us, and part of my job was to stay sharp, to know when the animals were near, and to make sure we never got careless. But sometimes, no matter how careful you are, the wild sneaks right up on you. This particular night, we were deep in the bush, far from the main camps. I was with a fellow guide, a friend of mine named Simon. We had a small group of tourists with us, maybe 6 people, and after a long day of hiking and driving, we'd set up our tents in a clearing near a dry riverbed. We cooked a simple meal, shared some stories by the fire, and then, as the cold set in, everyone retreated to their tents to sleep. The air was sharp that night, dry and cold, the kind of cold that cuts through even a thick sleeping bag. Inside my tent, I curled up tight, pulling the blanket over my head, trying to block out the chill. I remember listening to the faint sounds of the night outside, the crackle of the fire dying down, the rustling of the wind through the dry grass, the occasional grunt of a hippo or call of a distant jackal. At some point, I must have fallen into a deep sleep because when I woke up, it wasn't to any sound, it was to a feeling. Warmth. A strange, soft, heavy warmth pressed against my back. For a few seconds, still half asleep, I just lay there, enjoying it. After all, the night had been freezing, and the heat felt good, comforting even. But then, slowly, I became aware of something. My back was pressed right up against the canvas wall of the tent, and whatever was on the other side was alive. I stayed still, heart starting to pound. Through the thin canvas, I could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of breathing. It was heavy, powerful. Not the quick flutter of a small animal, but the slow, deep rhythm of something big. My mind started racing. What the hell was leaning against my tent? My first thought was maybe a buffalo or even an elephant, but no, they don't usually settle down next to a tent like that. Maybe a hyena? A leopard? As I lay there, not daring to move, I heard a sound from outside. A hushed voice, trembling slightly. It was Simon from his tent nearby. He called my name softly, just once, and I remember thinking, he knows something's wrong. Without thinking, I answered, my voice loud and clear, "Yeah, I'm awake." The second the words left my mouth, I felt the weight shift. Whatever was leaning on the tent gave a low, almost silent rumble. Not a growl, more like a deep exhale, and then it stood up. The whole side of the tent moved as the weight lifted, and I heard the unmistakable sound of large, padded paws moving off into the dark. For several long minutes, I didn't move. I just lay there, staring up at the roof of the tent, heart racing, hands clenched tight. Eventually, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent and step outside. Simon was already there, flashlight in hand, face pale. We didn't need to say anything. There, in the dirt just outside my tent, were the tracks. Massive paw prints, unmistakable in the soft ground. A big male lion had been lying right up against my tent, using it and me as a heat source on a freezing night. I remember walking around slowly, shining my light into the darkness, half expecting to catch a glimpse of glowing eyes watching us from the bushes. But the lion was gone, slipped back into the night like a shadow. The tourists, thankfully, hadn't stirred. They were still asleep, blissfully unaware of how close we'd all come to one of the most powerful predators on Earth. Simon and I didn't go back to sleep that night. We sat by the cold ashes of the fire, blankets wrapped around our shoulders, listening to the sounds of the bush, adrenaline still surging through our veins. When the sun finally came up, painting the dry grass golden and pushing back the chill, we packed up camp quietly. I remember feeling both shaken and strangely grateful. Grateful that the lion had only wanted warmth, that it hadn't been hungry or aggressive, that it had chosen to move on when I spoke. But more than anything, I was reminded of something I've carried with me ever since. Out here in the wild, we are guests. No matter how much experience we have, no matter how many times we tell ourselves we know what we're doing, nature is always bigger, older, and more unpredictable than we are. The lions don't care that you're a guide or that you've been trained or that you're careful. They move as they please, where they please, when they please. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they'll let you wake up in the morning to tell the story. After that night, I became even more cautious. I made sure campfires were kept burning longer, tents were positioned further from game trails, and food smells were tightly controlled. I started sleeping lighter, ears tuned to every shift in the night. But the truth is, there's only so much you can control. Because out here, under the wide African sky, the wild comes right up to the edge of your sleeping bag. And if it wants to lie down beside you on a cold winter night, you won't know until it's already there. About 7 years ago, I was on a long camping trip in Botswana. I'd been working as a wildlife photographer for a few years, and this trip was one I'd been planning for months. A solo journey across some remote parts of the bush, trying to capture photos of lions, leopards, and other big cats in their natural setting. I had no crew, no backup, just me, my camera gear, my tent, and a truck. It was the kind of trip that some people dream about, but few actually attempt. I wasn't new to the bush. I'd done smaller trips before, and I'd grown up around animals. In fact, back home I had a cat that loved curling up against my back on cold nights. I always thought of her as a little heat-seeking missile, pressing herself into me under the blankets. Maybe that's why, when the strange moment happened on that trip, my mind went to her. It was deep winter in Botswana, and though the days were dry and warm, the nights were bitterly cold. I was camped in a small, open clearing surrounded by bush and scrub, not far from a waterhole I'd been watching for several days. Animals came and went there, elephants, kudu, warthogs, and, a few times, lions in the distance. I kept my camp simple. My tent was a sturdy canvas dome, just big enough to stretch out in, and I always made sure to set it away from any animal trails. The camera gear stayed packed when I wasn't using it, and the truck was parked nearby for safety. That particular night, I remember feeling especially cold. The wind had been strong, and I'd gone to bed early, curled deep in my sleeping bag, wearing 2 layers of clothes, trying to stay warm. I lay there for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of the night, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant cough of a leopard, the rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. At some point, maybe around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. There was no sound, no sudden movement, just the feeling of waking. And then I realized something. There was weight against my back. Heavy weight, something warm, solid, pressing through the canvas wall of the tent. For a few seconds, still groggy with sleep, my brain tried to fit it into something familiar. I thought about my cat at home, the way she would snuggle against me, pushing her little body into the small of my back, purring softly as she drifted to sleep. But this wasn't small, and it wasn't inside the tent. My heart started to pound. I lay completely still, eyes wide open in the dark, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, trying to process what was happening. Outside, the thing behind me shifted slightly, pressing more firmly into the canvas. I could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of its breathing, deep, controlled, the breath of something big. The canvas separated us, but it felt paper thin. I knew better than to make any sudden moves. My mind was racing through possibilities. What animal was it? A buffalo? Maybe an elephant calf? But no, the breathing wasn't right. It was too quiet, too slow. I listened harder, and then I caught the faintest sound. A soft, heavy exhale, like a sigh. And that's when I knew. It was a lion, a big male by the weight and the sound of it. It was cold that night, colder than usual, and the lion, like my little cat at home, had found the warmest spot around, the heat coming off my body through the thin wall of the tent. I lay there for what felt like forever, barely daring to breathe. My mind ran in circles. Should I make a noise to scare it off? Should I stay still and hope it leaves on its own? Should I try to reach for something? A flashlight? Maybe? Or the knife I kept nearby? In the end, I did nothing. I stayed frozen, every muscle tight, heart hammering so loud in my chest I was sure the lion could hear it. Minutes passed. Long, slow, grinding minutes. And then the weight shifted. I felt the heavy body lean away from the tent, heard the soft crunch of massive paws stepping onto the dry grass, and then silence. I stayed where I was, not moving, hardly even blinking, listening for any sign that it was still nearby. Eventually, when I couldn't stand it anymore, I carefully unzipped the door just a few inches and peeked out. The night was empty. The camp was still. But right outside, in the dirt, I could see the tracks. Huge paw prints, clear and deep, circling the tent. The lion had been there, no doubt about it. And it hadn't come to hunt or attack. It had just wanted warmth. The same way my cat at home wanted to curl up beside me on cold nights. The thought was strange, almost funny, but it didn't make it any less terrifying. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the tent, knees drawn up, blanket wrapped tight around me, flashlight in hand, eyes darting to every sound outside. I waited for the dawn like it was a lifeline, watching the light slowly creep back across the sky. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out carefully, scanning the clearing for any sign of the lion. There was none. It was long gone, probably back in the bush, stretched out under a tree somewhere, warming itself in the first rays of sunlight. I spent the rest of the morning breaking camp. I didn't feel like staying another night. The weight of that experience, the raw reminder of just how thin the line was between me and the wild, had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't that I feared lions. I'd spent years photographing them, tracking them, watching them from a distance, but lying there in the dark, with nothing but a thin wall of fabric between us, I realized something important. Out here, I wasn't in control. No matter how skilled I thought I was, no matter how well I prepared, I was just another warm body in the cold, just another creature trying to survive the night. The lion didn't care about my plans, my work, my little routines. To him, I was a heat source, nothing more, just like my cat saw me as a heater in the middle of winter. That simple, humbling truth stayed with me long after I packed up and left the clearing. In the days that followed, I kept thinking about that night, about the feel of that massive, breathing weight pressed against my back. It was a story I never planned to tell many people, partly because it sounded unbelievable, and partly because it reminded me how vulnerable we really are, even when we think we're experienced, even when we think we're prepared. Back home, weeks later, I'd find myself lying in bed, my little cat curling up against me, purring softly as she snuggled into the warmth of my back. And every time I'd remember the lion, the big cat, the real cat, out there in the cold African night, just looking for a little warmth, just like her. But unlike her, he could have taken me apart in an instant if he'd wanted to. That was the part that stuck with me. The quiet, terrifying knowledge that I'd been spared not because of anything I did, but because the lion chose to let me be. And that's the thing about the wild. It doesn't care about you. You're not special. You're not in control. You're just another creature, lucky to wake up in the morning, lucky to tell the story. From that trip forward, I was never quite the same. I still went out into the bush, still tracked and photographed animals, still camped under the stars. But I carried a little more humility, a little more caution, and a deep, quiet respect for the thin line that separates us from the wild. The lion never came back to my camp. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night and the wind brushes against the side of my house, I remember the weight of that big, breathing body on the other side of the canvas. And I know in that moment that the wild is never really gone. It's always waiting just beyond the edge of the light. I remember this trip so clearly, even though it happened a few years back. It was one of those solo trips where I just wanted to get away from everything, the noise, the screens, the people. I picked a valley area out west, one I had read about online but hadn't visited before. It was the kind of place people described as remote or off the grid, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed up my truck with my tent, sleeping bag, some food, a small camp stove, beer, and a cooler full of snacks. The drive took most of the day. By the time I reached the trail I wanted to explore, the sun was already dipping low. But I figured I had time to hike at least a few miles before it got truly dark. I didn't want to waste the day sitting at camp. I stayed on the trail longer than I should have, honestly. I wasn't paying close attention to the time, just walking, taking in the trees and the breeze, feeling the quiet stretch out around me. As dusk settled in, the shadows grew longer, and that was when I ran into him, a local guy. He was maybe in his 50s, weathered face, a little rough around the edges but friendly enough. We crossed paths near a fork in the trail and he stopped to chat. I explained I was looking for a good camping spot nearby, something not too far from the road because I didn't want to carry all my gear deep into the woods at night. He told me about a spot near the river, kind of hidden, not marked, but popular with locals. It sounded perfect. I thanked him, we parted ways, and I made my way over there. He wasn't wrong, it was a good site. The river ran just a little ways off, close enough to hear the water flowing, but there were trees and brush making it hard to see from the road. I set up a fire quickly, cracked open a beer, and settled in. I didn't bother setting up the tent. By then it was dark, and I figured I'd just sleep in the back of the truck under the topper. Easier, quicker, and honestly, I was feeling a little lazy after the long day. That night was peaceful. I was loud, too, playing my friend's comedy podcast over a small speaker, laughing at the dumb jokes, drinking a couple more beers. I didn't think twice about it. Out here, no one was around to hear me. No cell service, no neighbors. Just me, the fire, the stars, the cold beer, and the sound of the river. Eventually, I crawled into the back of the truck, laid out my sleeping bag, and passed out. I remember thinking how glad I was that I hadn't bothered with the tent, especially as the temperature dropped. Inside the truck, I was snug, surrounded by my gear. The night passed without incident. I slept heavy, no bad dreams, no weird sounds waking me up. Morning came. I stretched, climbed out of the truck, and got to work making breakfast. I pulled out the small camp stove, got some eggs and bacon going, cracked another beer, because why not, it was a vacation, and tended the small morning fire I had going. The sun was already warming up the air, and it looked like it was going to be a clear, beautiful day. That's when I noticed him. There, at the edge of my camp, half hidden among the trees, was a man. He wasn't close, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, but close enough that I could see the details. He looked rough. Long, dirty beard, hair matted and unwashed, clothes that were basically rags. What stood out most, though, were the bags. Plastic grocery bags, tied all over his clothing, hanging from his arms, his waist, even his shoes. There had to be at least 100 of them. At first, I thought maybe he was just passing by, maybe a hiker or a local, but he didn't move on. He just stood there, pacing slowly, not looking at me directly, just hovering near the edge of the clearing. I tried to play it cool. I made a casual comment about the nice weather, tossed it out like you might to a stranger on the street. No response. I offered him some breakfast, called out that I had plenty of food. Still nothing. He just kept pacing, slow and steady, occasionally turning his back to me, never making eye contact. A cold feeling crept up my spine. I wasn't sure what his deal was. Maybe he was homeless. Maybe he was mentally unwell. Maybe he was just curious. But something about his presence set off alarm bells in my head. I felt exposed. Out here, with no cell service, no one else around, no help nearby, the situation could turn bad fast. I subtly checked where my gear was. My bear spray was close, my buck knife even closer. I kept one hand near them as I continued cooking, keeping my eyes flicking between the food and the man. I tried one last time, offering him a beer. Again, no response. He just stood there, pacing, silent. And that's when I realized this wasn't going anywhere good. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and gave him a loud, clear ultimatum. I told him firmly that he needed to acknowledge me or leave right now. He didn't react. That's when I grabbed the bear spray, stepped away from the fire, and moved a few steps toward him. Finally, he reacted. He turned slowly, sulking away, his plastic bags rustling softly as he moved back into the trees. I stood there, heart pounding, watching until he disappeared completely from sight. Then, without wasting a second, I went into overdrive. I doused the fire, threw my cooking gear and supplies into the back of the truck, packed everything up as fast as humanly possible. My hands were shaking, but I worked quickly, adrenaline surging through me. Within minutes, I was behind the wheel, engine running, pulling out of that hidden campsite and back onto the dirt road. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway miles away. As I drove, I kept thinking, had he been watching me during the night? Had he been standing there, just outside the firelight, while I sat by the flames, laughing, drinking, playing my podcast? The thought made my stomach turn. If I had set up the tent, if I had slept outside instead of inside the truck, would I have woken up with him standing right over me? Would he have tried something worse? I'll never know. What I do know is that I was lucky. My laziness, the decision to skip the tent and sleep inside the truck, might have saved me from something much worse. When I finally got home, I unloaded my gear, took a long shower, and sat in silence for a while, thinking about the trip. It had started as a peaceful escape, a simple camping trip to clear my head, but it had turned into something else entirely. A sharp, unsettling reminder that when you're alone in the wild, you're vulnerable. The man with the plastic bags is burned into my memory. I don't know who he was, or what he wanted, or how long he had been watching me, but I know I'll never camp solo in a hidden spot like that again without keeping one eye open at all times. Some people go into the woods looking for peace, but sometimes the woods send something back. And if you're not paying attention, you might not notice it standing at the edge of your camp until it's already too late. That's the part that stays with me. The image of that man, silent, pacing, just out of reach, just out of reason, wrapped in 100 plastic bags that rustled like dry leaves every time he moved. That sound still haunts me even now,